So in choosing a naval quarantine instead of a land invasion or bombing strikes, Kennedy, he did make the correct decision, finally, after that Bay of Pigs disaster. But in not choosing to do a bombing strike, he is not staging war, essentially. And a bombing strike may not have hit the target that they wanted. And keep in mind, if they're building missiles, then they maybe have the technology to blow us up anyway. So he didn't want to start anything that would start a war. Same with the soldiers invading. They probably have the capabilities if they're building surface-to-air missiles in Cuba to absolutely destroy any soldiers that show up. So here's a little picture of a quarantine, what a quarantine of Cuba looked like. The blockade would keep out a lot of military supplies. So we see for about a week, and if you've seen the movie 13 Days, it's a really good movie, you should watch it. For about a week, the world kind of watches as a Soviet ship carrying the rest of the missile parts steams towards Cuba. And any U.S. attack on that ship would have triggered a war, so we didn't do that. We just kept the blockade up. On October 24th, 16 Soviet ships come up to the blockade. It looks like things are about to go down, and then they turn around and go back home. And that's the end. But the thing is, people thought for about 13 days that the world was literally going to end, that this was going to be World War III, in a sense. So, JFK comes on TV. He announces that they're building nuclear missiles and they have nuclear technology in Cuba. Everyone thinks the world is going to end. They start building fallout shelters and gathering supplies, and but the ship stopped essentially. Oh, we're going to do that in class on Friday. So, moving on. So, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we will have for a second die down of tensions with the USSR. There's going to be a new spirit of cooperation, kind of bred out of the fear of, oh my gosh, we almost blew each other up, we almost died. Kennedy and Khrushchev realized that they had come dangerously close to nuclear war and wanted to work to prevent that from likely ever happening again. So Americans did not know this, but at the time, America had missiles staged in Turkey, kind of like they were staging missiles in Cuba, to get close to us, so the missiles would be in range of who we're trying to attack. So Khrushchev agrees to remove the missiles if, and it's like a secret correspondence we're going to read on Friday, if the U.S. removed its missiles from Turkey. And so publicly this favors Kennedy. It makes Kennedy look good because the U.S. is like, the Soviet Union backed off. It was great, while secretly removing the missiles that the American public didn't know about. But it is also a victory for Nikita Khrushchev because he saved Cuba from being invaded. He saved face a little bit in a sense. He didn't have to go to a full-scale war, and he got the U.S. missiles removed from Turkey. We will get the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in July 1963 from this, and essentially it bans atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. Land, sea, outer space, we can't detonate them and test them, so no more blowing up Pacific Islands, essentially. However, what this doesn't do is it doesn't get rid of stockpiles of nuclear weapons that we already have. It just says when we create something new, we can't test it, which will become an issue later. There's also going to be a Moscow-Washington hotline, a 24-hour access, phone line, essentially, between the two capitals, in a sense, in a way of saying, let's communicate instead of go straight to war when something, or if something were to happen. While all this is going on in Cuba, Kennedy is also dealing with issues coming to a head in Berlin. We had already seen that Berlin was split into East and West, with the West being democratic and the East being controlled by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had tried to block off all of Berlin, and that was the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift. But now there's going to be more demands to leave Berlin, and Kennedy refuses. Khrushchev gives another ultimatum, like he tried to do to Eisenhower, and both sides start arming Berlin. And again, in a different spot at the same time, people are fearful, they gasp, they hold their breath, that World War III is going to begin. But essentially, the decision is made that instead of fortifying and then attacking, the Soviets start building a wall. It starts with just barbed wire across, then it turns into a big old cement wall with barbed wire and armed troops guarding it all the time. And the Berlin Wall did not fall really until the end of the Cold War. We're looking at 1991. So Berlin is actually divided for most of the 20th century. And so there are armed guards at each station. It split a city in half. Some people had relatives. Some people's jobs were on the other half of Berlin, and all of a sudden there's a barbed wire fence and there's a concrete wall, and you have to have papers to pass. And the Soviets are very particular about who passes. And on the Soviet side, things were just not as good as on the Allied side, on West Berlin, when it comes to economy and freedom of speech and civil liberties and those sort of things. So here are pictures from 1991 when it falls, and both President Reagan and President George H.W. Bush had a hand in ending the Cold War, and we kind of point to this moment, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1991, where the Cold War ends, is kind of where we point to. JFK does actually visit Berlin during his time period after the Berlin Wall is fought, and he says, like, oh, a wall is better than a war. At least we're not killing each other. And this is one of his little speeches. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin, and therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner. And if you were to say this in German in Germany, Berliner is sometimes used as a name for like a pastry, kind of like a donut. So some people think that he said, I am a donut. I take pride in the words, I am a donut. But really, the people there knew what he was saying. The other word that they use for donut, they use more commonly than Berliner. So side note there. All right, when we're looking at Kennedy in general, foreign aid that doesn't have to do with the Cold War, Kennedy, actually, the Peace Corps was signed into law by Kennedy. It's one of his more popular foreign policy programs. It's in 1961. It sends young volunteers, doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, to third world countries to contribute to building up the economy and also the health of those areas. So they locally sponsor projects to build buildings and build schools and help with public health, to improve public education and health in those countries. And it's kind of like an alternative, oh, good, I put it on there, alternative to containment. So military containment was, we need to go help these countries so that they don't become communist, and we're going to send troops. But the Peace Corps is more like, we're going to go help these countries because it's the right thing to do. And side note, if they don't fall to communism because we prop them up, like, that's okay. The Alliance for Progress, also pretty successful in 1961. $20 billion is given to Latin America. Some people call it the Latin American Marshall Plan, at an attempt to help Latin American countries close the gap between rich and poor and kind of quiet the Communist Party in Latin American countries. It had good economic impacts, but it does little to solve the gap between rich and poor in Latin America, and we still see that gap today. So we will talk about this a little bit more in class. We'll watch this little video on Friday. But November 2nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas, JFK is there for a Southern tour to drum up support for his policies, and he's in a parade in an open-top limousine, and the governor of Texas is with him, and LBJ is there, and Lee Harvey Oswald shoots him from the 5th or 6th floor of a warehouse. You can go visit it now. Flees. He is caught and arrested. Then he is killed by Jack Ruby, so the assassin is assassinated, kind of, and it's just like a big fiasco. And we will talk more about it in class. We'll even watch this little video. But Lee Harvey Oswald, he had defected from the Soviet Union, come to the United States, come back. He had abused his wife. He had tried to kill a senator. He had a criminal history. And when he was in custody after JFK was pronounced dead, then he was actually shot as well. And there was seen to be no correlation between those two, like they weren't working together, essentially, is what the government investigated and found. And the Warren Commission is actually Warren Commission is actually who was in charge of figuring out what happened to JFK. It was ordered by Johnson, and essentially it was a government investigation. They ruled that Oswald was the lone assassin. He was not helped by Jack Ruby. There was no one else. And some people are like, really though? Because look at the killing. Look at how precise it was. Could a bullet have done that? And that's where some people say, oh, it must have been a magic bullet. And they're like poking fun at the Warren Commission, saying that there's no way he could have acted alone and shot Kennedy, because Kennedy's hit in the head, he's hit in the neck. There's stuff in the governor's arm and in his wrists and in his legs. So could a bullet have done that? And that's where all these conspiracy theories arise. We'll talk more about that in class. Here are pictures of, so that day, he's taken to the hospital, he's pronounced dead at the hospital. They take him out of the open-top limousine, the convertible limousine, and it's basically over with. And that day, about 4 hours later, they load his body in a casket. They, like, quickly order a casket. They put it on a plane underneath where LBJ and Jackie Kennedy are sitting right there. I'm sorry, you can't see where I'm pointing. I don't know why I'm doing it. But, so essentially, he's taking the oath of office. His wife, nicknamed Lady Bird Johnson, is next to him, and Jackie Kennedy is still there in that jacket that her husband's blood is all over, and his brains and his guts were all over, and it's disgusting. And that jacket is actually in the Smithsonian in the archives right now, and it can't be seen. In her will, she said she didn't want it to be seen for 100 years or 150 years. And then she starts planning JFK's, I call him by his nickname because we're so close, JFK's funeral, and she's like kind of obsessive over planning his funeral. She makes it almost exactly like Lincoln's funeral, and there's like some weird connections between Lincoln's assassination and JFK's assassination. Most of them are false, but it's kind of fun to theorize. So now we had a new president. He was young and new, and now we have a new president because JFK was assassinated. So this is Lyndon B. Johnson. I'm going to call him LBJ from now on. So Lyndon B. Johnson continues JFK's presidency just for a year. So he was killed in 1963 in November. LBJ runs for president in 1964 and is elected almost a year after that. So in November 1964, LBJ is running for re-election and he is elected. So that's not supposed to say JRK, that's supposed to say JFK. Sorry about that. He pledges to continue JFK's policy. Again, he kind of like waves the bloody shirt. He's saying like, oh, my JFK, we were such good friends. I mean, in a sense, he's saying those sort of things, and like he would want this to happen. He would want these policies to continue, and that's part of the reason that LBJ was able to pass such liberal things in the Great Society. LBJ is also going to be president at this time when civil rights just cannot be ignored any longer, and he will sign into law a lot of federal legislation about civil rights. He's going to sign into law some income tax things, but his biggest thing is the Great Society, and that is helping the poor. We will watch this video and I'll run back through. But essentially in 1964, he's running against Barry Goldwater, who's a Republican. They're slamming each other in the media. They're slamming each other on TV, but LBJ does win out. So, LBJ's largest foreign policy is called the War on Poverty or the Great Society. They're not like super interchangeable, but Great Society programs helped aid the War on Poverty, and we're going to do a little matching activity on Friday where you get to look more in depth at those War on Poverty, Great Society programs, but essentially it's like a sweeping set of like New Deal kind of like economic and welfare measures to transform America. And the idea is that he wants to help the poor, but it's also not just the poor, it's the elderly, it's the helpless, it's the environment, it's animals. There's lots of programs in the Great Society. We will look at all of these on Friday. Little quote from him: we have the opportunity to move not only towards the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the Great Society. The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice. So he's stepping out and saying, we have a good economy. We are a rich and powerful society, but really moving upward means that we have to get rid of the crap in our society, and the crap is racism and poverty. All right, we talked about this already, the Immigration Act of 1965. It stops the National Origins Acts from 1924, but the idea is it gives priority to families. It is now based on a first come, first serve, and so those with like skills or education or those with families will get priority. We're going to see a lot of Latin American and Asian immigration, but just for the most part until like the 90s, it opens up a lot of immigration in America. We're also going to see that LBJ will sign into law not sign into law, but like put funding towards the PBS, public broadcasting system, so like educational TV, and funding for the arts and immigration stuff as well as part of his Great Society.